G'day folks, welcome to the Whimsy Trail. Today we're going to learn how to make some trees, and it'll take about 3 or 4 hours depending on how crazy you go with it. We start with some strands of about 2mm thick wire. I just get it from the local hardware store in Australia for cheap. And we get about 15 strands of it at about 15 to 20 centimeters long. And then as you can see here, I've bent them in half, and then I get my pliers and get a good grip on them. Split them into a group of 2, get one of those groups of 2 and start splitting that in half, twisting that in half. And then with once we get about halfway, we get half of those and start twisting them in half, and so on, as you can see demonstrated in the video. When I'm doing these, I tend to just keep it flat and 2D. If you were to look at it top down, it would just sort of look like a straight line. It's not until the end where I start to actually pose the tree and get the canopy going. We're actually making 2 different styles of tree today as well, with 2 different sorts of bark textures on there. Now you can just see here I'm almost at the end of splitting up these trees, and it's starting to look pretty good. Just take your time, have fun with it, maybe look at some pictures of trees on the internet to get some inspiration. I'm just clipping off the end bits there. There's another little thing. At the end you can see they're pointing upwards. Like the very tips of the tree branches wire is pointing upwards, whereas on these ones they're pointing down. And if you look at the 2 next to one another, they sort of give an overall different feeling and vibe to the posed tree. So the one on the left is pointing up, the one on the right's pointing down. Use that knowledge wisely. Now on the second tree that I made, I wasn't really happy with the base of the trunk, so I'm just getting some tin foil wire, some tin wire here. We call it alfoil in Australia. I just get the cheap stuff from your local supermarket. It doesn't need to be super thick because you can just add more layers. And you can sort of see some trees, they look wider at the base and they sort of taper off as they get higher. And that's just what I'm trying to get going here with the extra added bits of alfoil. And it's looking alright. So the first way we're going to go for our textures is with this jute cord. It's threaded and twisted with 2 strands, and as you can see here I untwist it so I can just get it down to the 1 strand. I find just using a single strand gives finer textures overall once we're on the painting stage, and really helps the details and the natural looking textures to pop. And as you'll see at the end, it's all about contrasting natural textures, and the smaller your source materials the better. So I've just got the tree from before that we made out of the wire, and this is just standard PVA glue or craft glue. I just get the cheap stuff from the dollar store. A big bottle of it for about a litre is, they measure it by grams. A large bottle's about $15 Australian. And I'm using the jute cord here and just wrapping it around very tightly. So you want it to be tight on the actual base of the wire, as well as tightly wound next to one another. You can do a couple of layers of this, and on the film here I'm only doing the 2 layers because this is a very time consuming method. This is what will actually take you most of your time, is wrapping up these wires with the jute cord. I think overall it's worth spending the time, because at the end you'll see of the 2, this one has more of a gnarled fantasy feel. So the second method that we use is dried leaves. I just get them off the ground and I bake them in my oven for about 20 minutes on 80 degrees Celsius to get rid of any bugs or any yucky germs from dogs weeing on them. I literally just, when I go for a walk, pick them up off the ground. And also after you've baked them for a little while, it dries them out and helps them grind up. So once they're baked, I put them in a blender. The blender blends them up to a large size, and then I put them in a coffee machine to get them nice and fine. And as you can see here, I've just layered the wire with some PVA glue, and then I'm just sprinkling the ground leaves over the top of that. You'll have to come back and do 2 to 3 layers of this because the alfoil shines through. And this is time consuming as well, but nowhere near as time consuming as wrapping up the other one. Now, I'm not really happy with how that second one came out, but that's fine. So now we've got the jute cord again, and I'm just chopping it up into 1 centimeter sections, approximately 1 centimeter lengths. And once I've got those, I will put them in my coffee machine. And what we're doing here is once they come out of the coffee machine, they get all fluffy, and then we just hot glue clumps of that onto the branches of the tree to form a larger surface area to put the spray glue on. As you can see here, I'm loading it up into my trusty coffee grinder. That was just 14 Australian dollars from a local Kmart, and I just buzz it for about 10-15 seconds. You'll be able to tell as soon as you open it up if it's worked or not, and as you can see here, it's very fluffy, and that's what we're going for. But there was a couple of strands in the bottom that still hadn't fluffed out, so just keep them in there and buzz them up again for about 10-15 seconds, and it will be fine. I'm just going to do a little bit more there and pack up the grinder. Now you can see here, that's the finished product, and it's nice and fluffy. It's like a polyfiber by the end of it, although we've made it ourselves out of $2 jute cord. Woohoo! You can see here I've got some spray adhesive, and for the second and third layers of the ground leaf method, we just use spray adhesive because it's a lot easier and quicker. And at the very end, I'm just trimming off the edges of this still silver exposed wire. Now comes the fun part. We've got our fluffed up poly fibers from the jute cord that we made ourselves, and I've just got my hot glue gun, and what I'm doing is I'll put a little bit of hot glue on the end of a couple of the branches and then just very gently place the poly fibers on the top of that. Now you don't want to push too hard down on the poly fibers, you want them to keep as much of their natural shape and texture as possible. If you go and look at nature, it is very random. The shapes aren't symmetrical and beautiful and perfectly balanced. It's random and chaotic and cacophonous, and it's beautiful. That's what I love about it. So you can see here, I just take it 2 or 3 limbs at a time because the hot glue has a tendency to dry very quickly. Now what I've got here is this dried moss. This is one of the very few bits of texture products that I actually buy. You can just buy it from your local hobby shop. It's about 8 Australian dollars for a big bag of it, and I really like it. So I've just got some spray adhesive, and as you see there, I was pointing in a downwards direction. So you want to spray from the top down onto the poly fibers that we've just hot glued on, and then dip that into the container full of the moss. Just be careful when you're working with spray adhesive because it gets everywhere. It's incredibly sticky, and all of this stuff will just stick to you for ages. Not only that, but it's quite toxic and it smells really bad. So make sure you're using a well-ventilated area if you can't be outside. If you are inside, get a fan going, crack the window. Now we're moving on to the same method, but for the other tree. I just spend a little bit of time posing this tree up with the branches before I put the hot glue on. And I'm just doing the exact same method where I just do 2 or 3 limbs at a time and then just very gently place the poly fibers on there. Again, I want to reiterate, you want to keep the random clumped shapes of the poly fibers as opposed to pushing them down and getting them all symmetrical. Take your time, enjoy yourself. And again, here we come with spraying downwards with the incredibly smelly spray adhesive. And then once that's done, we just dip this into the flocking. This is a different sort of flocking than the last one. This is some homemade moss flocking that I've made myself, and you can check out how to do that on my How to Make Materials videos. I think both of the flockings have strengths and weaknesses. The final layer is the same ground up leaves, but try and get the finest ones, and then again you just spray on a top down direction on your canopy and then do a gentle sprinkle of the leaves on the top. And what we're trying to do here is get the illusion of texture and shadow by putting some darker leaves on the top, but in a downward facing direction. Now I learnt this from a method that you use to undercoat miniatures called Zenithax highlighting, and I'm sort of going for the same things there. Now comes the fun part. The first method we use with the jute chord, we want to paint up the trunk and the branches, and to do that going to do an overbrush dry brush method with 3 different layers of color, and we go from darkest to lightest, from lowest points to the highest points. If you look closely at the trunk, you'll see that as the jute cord has been wrapped around it, there are some crevasses or some deep bits, and then there are some higher bits. And so with the first layer, we just want to cover everything with the darkest shade we're going to use. In this case, I'm just using a burnt umber. These are just cheap hobby paints from a $2 store. I water them down, and when I paint with them, I make sure my brush is loaded up with water also, just to get some capillary action to help fill in those recesses. You don't want to do this on the second 2 layers, because the second 2 layers we want to control where the paint lands more. On to layer 2. I've still got a little bit of that first color in my palette, and I just squish a little bit of white out next to the palette there. I don't put it in the palette because I want to be able to control how much I'm going to add to it. And I just add a little bit of white to lighten down the brown that's in there. And as you can see, it just lightens it up a little bit. We don't want it too bright because we want the final layer to be the brightest one. So this method, we are using what's called an overbrush method, and as you can see, as I'm mixing through that paint, I'm twisting my brush around. The brush is fully loaded, but it's not dripping with paint, if that makes sense. So then when I brush onto the tree there, I'm just very gently applying the brush so that it only just goes over the uppermost layers of the textures or of the branches there. You just very gently apply the paint to it, so you're not pushing with the brush very hard, you just ever so lightly just brushing across the very edge of it, and I'm going in a vertical motion up and down, where the chord is going in a horizontal motion. If you do it that way, you'll be able to get the textures to pop a little bit more, and the paint will only stay on the toppermost bit. I've lightened down the palette again, and this time I've actually pulled out some paper towel, just so that when my brush is loaded up, I get most of it off on a paper towel. And then I just ever so lightly do the final layer with the lighter brown shade, and when we zoom in, you can see the finished product, where you have a dark brown undercoat, and then it gets lighter as it gets higher. And it's a pretty subtle effect. You can add more layers and add more, like, lighten up the shade, and you'll get like more of a pronounced pronounced effect. But I like this one. It's very subtle, but it still looks realistic and gnarled, and I really like the way the textures of the canopy and the leaves contrast with the texture of the bark. Look at that. It's so gnarled. This is the second method with the sprinkled on dried leaves. Not as happy with the canopy on this one, but if I had have taken a little bit more time to do the wire twisting initial building phase, I think that would have come out better. But you can still see the difference in the natural textures on the bark and on the canopy, which is what we're going for. And here's back to my favourite one. But again, all art is subjective. You might love the second one, I might love the first one, and we're both right and wrong, and that's okay. Art's not a competition, music's not a competition. No one's right, no one's wrong. So thanks for checking out the Whimsy Trail tutorials, and I'd really love to see what you do with these methods. I hope the rest of your day is excellent and you're feeling powerful.